On the afternoon of March 5, 1942, at precisely 4:40 p.m., Lieutenant Commander Harry Linwood Hicks stepped onto the deck of USS Attic at the Portsmouth Navy Yard in Kittery, Maine, assuming command of a vessel that had absolutely no business heading into combat. A career naval officer hailing from South Carolina, Hicks had graduated from the Naval Academy back in 1928. Throughout his service by 1942, he'd gained extensive experience aboard destroyers and cruisers, mastering both gunnery techniques and tactical operations. The vessel in question was USS Attic, designated with hull number AK-101, essentially a rust-covered cargo steamer that had been plying the seas for 3 decades and looked every bit the part of what it actually was, a sluggish, unprotected merchant ship. Yet beneath this unassuming exterior, USS Attic carried armaments capable of sending a German submarine straight to the ocean floor. Concealed behind cleverly designed false panels were 4 4-inch naval guns, while 8 machine guns lay hidden within fake deck houses, and 6 depth-charge projectors were cunningly disguised as ordinary cargo handling equipment. The ship's holds had been stuffed full of pulpwood, a strategic choice designed to keep her buoyant even after taking torpedo strikes. According to her official documentation, USS Attic was actually a merchant vessel called SS Villefranca, supposedly sailing under Portuguese registry and making her way alone through waters crawling with German U-boats. The truth, however, was far more intriguing. She represented America's most closely guarded naval weapon, a Q-ship, essentially a floating ambush designed specifically to entice German submarines into surfacing so they could be obliterated at point-blank range. The origins of Project LQ can be traced back to sheer desperation. Back on January 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt had floated the idea to Admiral Ernest King, who commanded the entire United States fleet, suggesting that perhaps deploying Q-ships might prove useful in combating the menacing U-boat threat. Admiral King, harboring certain reservations about the concept, nevertheless interpreted this suggestion as a direct order and moved swiftly to implement it. 5 civilian vessels underwent secret conversions into Navy warships at the Portsmouth Navy Yard facility. The operation proceeded without any press announcements or entries in the standard Navy record-keeping systems. The Navy allocated $500,000 from an emergency fund, ensuring that these expenditures wouldn't be subject to scrutiny through the normal requisition channels. Every document related to the program was secured in a classified file maintained exclusively by the Chief of Naval Operations. The driving force behind this entire program was simple. German U-boats were sending American ships to the bottom faster than American shipyards could replace them. By January 12, 1942, British intelligence had detected an alarming concentration of U-boats positioned off the North American coastline, stretching from New York all the way up to Cape Race, and they'd promptly shared this critical intelligence with the United States Navy. That very same day, Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Hardigan, commanding U-123, launched a torpedo attack that sank the British steamship Cyclops approximately 350 miles southeast of Cape Sable, Nova Scotia, resulting in 98 deaths. This marked the beginning of Operation Drumbeat. Throughout the following 6 weeks, German submarines systematically destroyed ship after ship within full view of American shorelines. Tankers would burst into flames and burn, while spectators watched helplessly from the beach. Freighters disappeared beneath the waves while lighthouse keepers looked on. Beaches that normally attracted tourists became littered with oil slicks and wreckage. The U-boat commanders referred to this period as the Second Happy Time. American cities along the coast stubbornly refused to implement blackout measures, fearing the negative impact on their tourism industries. Navigation lights continued burning brightly through the night. Ships sailed independently, fully illuminated, following routes that were entirely predictable. For the German submarine commanders, it was essentially target practice, with no challenge whatsoever. During the 3-month period from January through March 1942, U-boats succeeded in sinking 137 Allied vessels in American territorial waters. This represented over 650,000 tons of shipping lost, 3 million gallons of fuel oil, essential supplies, food stocks, weapons, and ammunition, all sent to the ocean floor. American destroyers and patrol aircraft found themselves committed to convoy escort duties in the North Atlantic theater, leaving the eastern seaboard with virtually no defensive capability. Somebody needed to take action, and quickly. Navy shipyard workers at Portsmouth invested 3 intense weeks converting Attic and her sister, ship Asterion, into Q-ships. They carefully cut openings in the deck to accommodate the concealed weaponry. They installed hydraulic panel systems engineered to drop away within seconds, instantly revealing the hidden guns. They reinforced the internal bulkheads to withstand the tremendous recoil forces generated by 4-inch naval artillery. They constructed ammunition hoists running from the storage holds up to the gun positions. Every modification was carefully disguised to resemble standard cargo handling equipment. The conversion work consumed 3 full weeks, a rush job by any standard. The chief of the Bureau of Ships had established an ambitious deadline, demanding that both Attic and her sister, ship Asterion, be fully converted and combat-ready by March 1st, 1942. They barely managed to meet this deadline, though in truth the ships weren't genuinely prepared for combat operations. Attic was a 30-year-old civilian steamer, originally constructed back in 1912, equipped with a single propeller screw and a steam engine that could barely push her to 9 knots maximum speed. She had absolutely no armor plating whatsoever. While the guns were cleverly concealed, they were relatively lightweight weapons. The crew had received only 3 weeks of training in total, and most of them had never experienced actual combat. The operational plan was straightforward in theory, at least. Attic would sail independently through areas known to be active U-boat hunting grounds, deliberately presenting herself as an easy mark. A slow-moving merchant ship traveling without escort or visible defensive armaments. When a U-boat eventually spotted her, German doctrine suggested the submarine would surface rather than waste a valuable torpedo on such a slow cargo vessel. This was standard German procedure, actually. Torpedoes were expensive and somewhat scarce resources. A sluggish cargo ship simply wasn't worth expending a torpedo when the deck gun could do the job. German commanders would typically surface their boats, close to short range, and use their deck-mounted artillery to finish off their victim with gunfire. That precise moment would be when Attic would drop her false panels, unveil her concealed guns, and unleash devastating fire at extremely close quarters. Supporting destroyers were theoretically supposed to be positioned nearby, ready to help finish off the damaged U-boat once Attic had wounded it. That was the theory, anyway. The first Q-ship to be lost was actually a fishing trawler designated Eagle. She departed on patrol during February 1942 under the command of Lieutenant Commander Leonard Roscoe. The Navy had acquired a Boston beam trawler called MS Wave, and briefly designated her as an auxiliary minesweeper with the designation USS Eagle, AM-132, before reclassifying her as USS Captor, PYC-40, for Q-ship operations. Eagle represented the smallest vessel in the 5-ship Q-ship fleet, displacing a mere 300 tons or so. Her diminutive size was supposed to work to her advantage. German submarines might consider her too insignificant a target to justify wasting a torpedo, preferring instead to surface and sink her with gunfire. But Eagle found absolutely nothing during her patrols. She cruised the shipping lanes off the New England coastline for 2 solid weeks in February, never once encountering a U-boat or any potential targets, and eventually returned to port suffering from engine problems. The Navy dispatched her on another patrol in March, with identical results. No contact whatsoever, no U-boats spotted, just more mechanical failures plaguing the aging vessel. By the time April rolled around, the Navy had essentially given up on Eagle as a Q-ship concept. She was reassigned to regular patrol duties and spent the remainder of the war in considerably less glamorous roles. The second attempt involved USS Asterion, which was Attic's twin sister ship. Commander George Walter Legwin assumed command of her. Asterion was virtually identical to Attic in almost every conceivable respect, built in the same year, 1912, carrying the same armament, equipped with the same disguised weapon systems, loaded with the same pulpwood cargo. She received her commission on February 27, 1942, arriving just 1 week ahead of Attic's commissioning. Asterion and Attic departed Portsmouth together on March 23rd, setting out on what was officially designated as a shakedown cruise but rapidly transformed into an active combat patrol. The 2 vessels received orders to navigate in such a way that one ship would be positioned approximately 480 miles south of the other after 5 days at sea. This dispersal strategy was intended to maximize their coverage of the coastal shipping lanes, while theoretically maintaining some degree of mutual support capability. In reality, though, 480 miles was far too great a distance for any effective mutual support whatsoever. If one ship encountered trouble, the other vessel couldn't possibly arrive in time to provide assistance. On the night of March 26th, Asterion was cruising approximately 240 miles south of where Attic was positioned. At roughly 8:45 p.m. Eastern Wartime, Asterion's radio operator picked up faint distress signals, SOS, ship torpedoed. The signals came through broken and fragmentary, extremely difficult to interpret clearly. Asterion's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Legwin, immediately ordered a course change toward the source of these transmissions, but the exact position remained uncertain. The signals had been weak and intermittent at best. Asterion steamed northward through the darkness, searching desperately. When first light broke on March 27th, the lookouts scanned the horizon in every direction, but they saw absolutely nothing. No ships, no wreckage, no survivors, no U-boats. The ocean appeared completely empty. Asterion continued her search operation throughout the entire day, methodically covering a grid pattern around the estimated position where the distress call had originated. At 2:00 p.m., they finally discovered some debris, small fragments of wood, cork flotation devices, a single empty life jacket, and spreading oil slicks. This wreckage was scattered across several square miles of ocean. There was absolutely no way to identify which ship it had come from originally. It could have been any one of dozens of vessels that had been sunk in recent weeks. Asterion continued searching until darkness fell, but found nothing else of significance. Legwin faced a difficult decision at that point: continue the search operation or resume his assigned patrol mission. He chose to resume the patrol, reasoning that Asterion was supposed to be actively hunting U-boats, not conducting search and rescue operations that other vessels could handle more appropriately. Legwin took Asterion back to her designated patrol area and continued the Q-ship mission for another 4 days. She never encountered any U-boats or engaged any targets. On March 31st, Asterion received orders directing her to return to port. The Navy was beginning to realize that Project LQ simply wasn't producing results. Back at Portsmouth, Legwin filed his comprehensive patrol report, making sure to mention the distress call and the wreckage they'd discovered. Intelligence officers compared his report with other available information and concluded that the distress call had probably originated from USS Attic. Asterion had been the closest vessel to Attic's position when she came under attack. But even Asterion had been positioned too far away to render assistance. By the time she'd reached the general area, Attic had been gone for 12 hours already. The wreckage that Asterion discovered might have come from Attic, or it might have belonged to one of the other ships sunk during that particular week. There was simply no way to determine this with any certainty. The third vessel in Project LQ was USS Big Horn, a tanker that had been converted to resemble a civilian oiler. She sailed in April 1942 under the command of a Navy captain. Big Horn spent 6 full weeks at sea without establishing any U-boat contacts whatsoever. She returned to port in May with absolutely nothing to report. The program was failing, though not because the Q-ships themselves were ineffective. Rather, the U-boats were learning to exercise caution. German submarine commanders had already fought against British Q-ships during World War I, so they knew the tactic intimately and understood that some merchant ships carried hidden armaments. By March 1942, German naval intelligence had issued warnings to all U-boat commanders, instructing them to remain wary of suspicious-looking cargo vessels sailing alone along convoy routes. Lieutenant Commander Harry Linwood Hicks understood the odds perfectly well. He'd received thorough briefings about the program and knew that British Q-ships in World War I had achieved mixed success at best. He knew that Project LQ was entirely experimental in nature. He knew that 4 previous Q-ship patrols had produced exactly 0 U-boat kills. He knew that Attic was slow, barely armed, and extremely vulnerable to attack. But despite all this, Hicks believed in the mission's importance. Hicks had been born in Kentucky and grew up in a small town before joining the Navy in 1926. He'd worked his way up through the enlisted ranks before eventually attending officer candidate school. He'd served aboard destroyers and cruisers, gaining expertise in gunnery and tactical operations. He had spent 3 weeks training his crew on how to operate the concealed weapons systems, how to drop the false panels instantly, how to aim accurately under combat conditions, and how to remain hidden until the very last possible moment. The crew of USS Attic consisted of 141 men total: officers, petty officers, gunners, engine room personnel, and deck hands. Most were in their 20s, some were still teenagers, and a few were in their 30s. They came from every corner of America: farm towns, industrial cities, coastal communities. Some had been serving in the Navy for years already, while others had enlisted immediately after Pearl Harbor. Every single one of them knew they were sailing directly into danger. On the morning of March 23, 1942, Attic cast off her lines from Portsmouth Navy Yard at 1 p.m. sharp. The weather was clear and cold with a north wind blowing. Attic looked exactly like what she was supposed to be: an old cargo steamer with rust streaks staining her hull, faded paint, no visible weapons of any kind, and no Navy markings whatsoever. She wasn't even flying a flag, appearing to be just another merchant ship heading out to sea. Shipyard workers stood on the dock watching as Attic gradually disappeared beyond the harbor breakwater. All anyone could do at that point was wait anxiously. The fatal engagement occurred on the night of March 26, 1942. Attic was cruising alone approximately 300 miles east of Norfolk, Virginia, in moderate seas under an overcast sky with limited visibility. At 5 p.m., a lookout aboard U-123 spotted smoke on the horizon. Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Hartigan was conducting his second patrol off the American coast and had already sent 9 ships to the bottom during this mission. His crew was experienced and battle-hardened after hunting for 3 solid weeks, and they knew exactly what to look for. Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Hartigan was only 29 years old in 1942. Born on March 18, 1913, he'd originally trained as a naval aviator before injuries, sustained in a crash, brought him into the U-boat service in November 1939. He took command of U-123 in May 1941, and by March 1942, he was conducting his second patrol to American waters, having already proven himself as one of Germany's most effective submarine commanders. On December 23, 1941, U-123 had departed from Lorient, France as part of Operation Drumbeat. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who commanded the U-boat fleet, had personally selected only 5 Type 9 long-range submarines for the first wave of attacks against the American coastline. These were U-123, U-130, U-66, U-125, and U-109. These particular boats had sufficient range to cross the Atlantic, operate for weeks off the American seaboard, and then return to France successfully. Most German U-boats simply couldn't make that journey. The Type 9 boats were considerably larger than standard submarines, had much greater fuel capacity, and could carry more torpedoes than the standard Type 7 submarines that typically operated in the North Atlantic. Hartigan's assigned mission was to penetrate as close as possible to New York Harbor and sink as much shipping as he could. On January 12, 1942, he sank the British freighter Cyclops off Nova Scotia, inaugurating Operation Drumbeat ahead of the official schedule. Over the following 3 weeks, he moved progressively south along the American coast, methodically sinking ship after ship, tankers, freighters, and cargo vessels. Most were sailing independently, fully illuminated, and following entirely predictable routes. American coastal cities stubbornly refused to implement blackout procedures, and navigation lights remained burning for the U-boat commanders to use as reference points. It was almost absurdly easy, really. Hartigan later wrote in his patrol log that it was unbelievable how completely unprepared the Americans were for submarine warfare. The entire coastline was illuminated like a carnival or festival, and ships were perfectly silhouetted against the glow emanating from coastal cities. On his first patrol, Hartigan succeeded in sinking 9 ships totaling 53,000 tons. He returned to Lorient on February 9, 1942, and was awarded the Knight's Cross for his achievements. After completing refitting and resupply operations, U-123 departed on March 24th for a second patrol mission. Hartigan's orders remained the same: hunt American shipping aggressively, sink everything possible, conserve torpedoes, whenever feasible by using the deck gun on smaller defenseless targets, and return to base when ammunition or fuel ran low. When U-123's lookout spotted the target on the evening of March 26th, Hartigan studied it carefully through his binoculars. It was an old cargo steamer with a single funnel, traveling at slow speed, with no escort vessels and no defensive armament visible. This was exactly the kind of ship that wasn't worth wasting a valuable torpedo on. Hartigan decided to shadow the target until conditions were optimal, then surface and attack using his deck gun, standard procedure that would save the torpedoes for more valuable targets. U-123 followed Attic for hours, staying submerged and out of sight, simply watching and waiting patiently. At 7:37 p.m., Hartigan gave the order to surface. U-123 moved into firing position at a range of 700 yards, and Hartigan fired one G-7E torpedo. The torpedo struck Attic on the port side, directly under the bridge structure. The explosion was absolutely massive, with fire erupting from the cargo holds and the ship listing slightly to port. Men could be seen running on deck in apparent panic, and a lifeboat was being lowered on the starboard side. It looked exactly like a normal merchant ship taking a torpedo hit. Crew abandoning ship, no weapons, no defense, just another victim. Hartigan maneuvered U-123 around Attic's stern to finish the job properly. That was the moment when Hicks gave the order to spring the trap. The hydraulic panels dropped away instantly. The 4-inch guns swung into firing position, and 8 machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The first 4-inch shell landed short of U-123, sending up a massive splash of water. The second shell was off in deflection, and the third missed high. But the machine gun fire raked across the submarine's conning tower, and one round struck Fenrich zur See Rudi Holzer, a midshipman standing watch on the bridge. He went down with a severe chest wound. Hartigan reacted instantly, ordering full throttle and emergency dive procedures. U-123's diesel engines poured out thick black smoke as the submarine accelerated away from Attic at maximum speed. The gunners kept firing desperately, but the target was moving fast and presenting an extremely narrow profile. The shells continued missing their mark. U-123 submerged successfully before Attic could land a killing shot. Hartigan had been incredibly lucky. He'd come within mere seconds of being destroyed completely. His submarine had taken machine gun fire, and one of his crew was dying. But the boat itself was intact, and he could still fight. U-123 circled underwater and approached Attic from a completely different angle. At 9:29 p.m., Hartigan fired a second torpedo. This one struck Attic's engine room directly. The explosion destroyed the boilers completely, and steam and smoke poured from the hull. The single propeller stopped turning. Attic was dead in the water, with her bow settling and stern rising. The crew was abandoning ship in earnest now, with lifeboats in the water and men jumping overboard. Hartigan surfaced at 3:27 a.m. to watch Attic sink, but the ship was still stubbornly afloat, refusing to go down. The pulpwood cargo was keeping her buoyant despite the extensive torpedo damage. At 10:50 p.m., something inside Attic detonated catastrophically. The ship exploded in a massive blast that lit up the entire night sky, with debris flying hundreds of feet into the air. When the flames finally cleared, USS Attic was simply gone. Nothing remained except wreckage and spreading oil. All 141 men were dead, the entire crew, with no survivors whatsoever. The lifeboats had been in the water, but a severe gale blew in immediately after the explosion, and the storms killed anyone who might have survived the blast. Hartigan buried Fenrich zur See Rudi Holzer at sea 10 minutes later. 1 German casualty, 141 American casualties, and U-123 left the area to continue hunting. The first search aircraft arrived at Attic's last reported position at 8:01 a.m. on March 27th. A U.S. Army Air Force bomber from the 1st Bomber Command. The pilot flew a methodical grid pattern for 4 solid hours, but found absolutely nothing. No wreckage, no survivors, no oil slick. The storm had scattered everything across miles of ocean, and the visibility was poor with whitecaps, making it nearly impossible to spot debris. USS Noah, a Clemson-class destroyer that had been commissioned back in 1918, steamed to the site under the command of Lieutenant Commander Harold Grow Ford. Noah was one of the very few destroyers available on the eastern seaboard at that time. since most had been assigned to convoy escort duty in the North Atlantic Theater. NOAA searched for 12 hours straight, methodically covering the area where Atik had transmitted her distress signals. The crew spotted small pieces of debris, life jackets, wooden planks, cork floats, but nothing that could definitively be identified as coming from USS Atik. The ship had simply disintegrated completely. USS Sagamore, a fleet tug designated AT-20, attempted to reach the area but was forced back by heavy seas. The Atlantic was notoriously dangerous in late March, with storm systems moving through regularly, wind speeds exceeding 40 knots, and waves running 15 to 20 feet. Small vessels like tugs simply couldn't operate safely in those conditions. On March 30th, 3 full days after the sinking, patrol aircraft discovered 5 empty lifeboats drifting approximately 80 miles south of the attack site. The boats had been blown off course by the gale and were completely empty. No bodies, no supplies, no indication whatsoever of what had happened to the men who had launched them. The lifeboats were marked with USS Atik's identification numbers, and that was the only physical evidence ever recovered. The 141 men were simply gone, swallowed by the Atlantic Ocean. What nobody in the U.S. Navy realized at the time was that the Germans knew exactly what had happened. On April 9, 1942, Radio Berlin broadcast a message stating that the High Command announced today that a Q-boat of 3,000 tons was sunk by torpedo after a battle fought partly on the surface with artillery and partly beneath the water with bombs and torpedoes. The Germans knew about Project LQ. They knew the Americans were using Q-ships. They knew USS Atik was not a merchant vessel, and German intelligence had been tracking the program. U-boat commanders received explicit warnings to watch for armed merchant ships operating alone, and the element of surprise was completely gone. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, was absolutely furious. Project LQ had been his response to Roosevelt's suggestion to use Q-ships. The program had cost $500,000, involved 5 ships being converted, required months of training, demanded complete operational security, and it had produced exactly 0 U-boat kills. Worse still, USS Atik had been sunk on her very first patrol with all hands lost, and the Germans had broadcast the kill to the entire world. The program was exposed for what it was. King ordered an immediate comprehensive review of the entire program. The review was absolutely brutal in its findings. Q-ships were too slow to chase U-boats effectively, too lightly armed to win surface engagements, and too vulnerable to torpedo attacks. The crews had received inadequate training for their mission. The doctrine was fundamentally flawed from the start. German U-boat commanders were too experienced and cautious to fall for the trap. Supporting forces were positioned too far away to provide help when Q-ships got into trouble. The entire program was simply a waste of precious resources. King ordered all Q-ship patrols suspended immediately. USS Asterion was recalled from patrol in April 1942. USS Bighorn completed one final patrol in May and was reassigned to cargo duty. USS Eagle was decommissioned entirely. USS Captor was sent to the Pacific Theater, where she served as a patrol vessel, but never actually engaged an enemy submarine. The only Q-ship that saw any real action was USS Anacapa in the Pacific, and she almost sank 2 American submarines by accident when they entered her patrol area without proper identification. By August 1942, Project LQ was completely over and abandoned. Then the Germans started noticing something strange happening. In May 1942, U-boat losses began increasing dramatically. 3 submarines were sunk in American waters. In June, 5 more went down. In July, 7 submarines were destroyed. But the kills were not coming from Q-ships at all. They were coming from destroyer escorts, patrol aircraft, and significantly improved convoy tactics. The United States Navy had learned valuable lessons. Convoys were organized systematically, air coverage was extended progressively farther, new radar systems were deployed across the fleet, depth charges were improved substantially, and destroyer escorts were being built specifically for anti-submarine warfare operations. The tactics that actually worked were not Q-ships at all. They were coordinated air and sea patrols with proper equipment and thorough training. By September 1942, German submarine operations off the American coast had become too dangerous to continue. U-boat commanders received orders to focus their efforts on mid-Atlantic convoy routes where American defenses remained weaker. Operation Drumbeat was over, and the second happy time had definitively ended. Between January and August 1942, the entire German U-boat campaign, during Operation Drumbeat, succeeded in sinking 397 Allied ships in American waters, representing over 2 million tons of shipping. Approximately 5,000 merchant sailors were killed, and cargo worth hundreds of millions of dollars was lost to the depths. Reinhard Hartigan himself was credited with sinking 22 ships, totaling 114,000 tons across his entire career. But the rate of sinking was dropping steadily. American shipyards were building Liberty ships faster than U-boats could possibly sink them. The convoy system was proving effective. Air patrols were working. Radar was finding submarines before they could attack, and direction-finding equipment could locate U-boats by their radio transmissions. Code breaking became increasingly sophisticated. By mid-1943, Allied intelligence was reading German naval communications on a regular basis. Convoy routes were being adjusted to avoid known U-boat concentrations, and task forces were being dispatched to hunt U-boats whose positions had been revealed by decrypted messages. Training improved dramatically as well. New destroyer escort crews spent months in specialized schools, learning anti-submarine tactics in depth. They practiced attack runs repeatedly, studied U-boat behavior patterns, and learned to work as coordinated teams. By 1944, American and British escort crews were highly skilled professionals who knew their business inside and out. Industrial production simply overwhelmed the German submarine force completely. American shipyards built Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. In 1942, the United States launched over 5 million tons of merchant shipping. In 1943, over 19 million tons were launched. By 1944, the production rate exceeded anything the U-boats could possibly destroy. Even at the peak of their effectiveness in 1942, U-boats sank less than 8 million tons per year. The numbers were completely unsustainable for Germany in the long run. Perhaps most importantly, the Allies never gave up the fight. When tactics failed, they tried new tactics. When technology proved inadequate, they developed better technology. When training was insufficient, they improved the training programs. When resources were lacking, they built more resources. The war in the Atlantic was won through relentless, systematic improvement over time. Project LQ represented the exact opposite approach. It was a desperate gamble on an unproven concept, relying on outdated tactics from World War I, wasting resources that could have been used far more effectively, sending men to sea in ships that weren't ready for combat. And when it failed spectacularly, the program was quietly abandoned without learning the right lessons from the failure. The right lesson wasn't that Q-ships couldn't work in theory. The right lesson was that gimmicks don't win wars. Steady application of proven methods wins wars. Technology, training, resources, and determination win wars. USS Attic proved that lesson at the terrible cost of 141 lives. Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Hartigan returned to Lorient on May 2, 1942, having completed 2 patrols during Operation Drumbeat. He'd sunk 19 ships totaling 90,000 tons across both patrols combined. He received the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, which was Germany's highest military decoration at the time. Adolf Hitler personally awarded him the medal at his headquarters in East Prussia. Photographs from that meeting show Hartigan, looking pale and thin after weeks at sea, standing rigidly at attention while Hitler pinned the oak leaves to his uniform. But Hartigan was finished with combat patrols after that. The physical and psychological strain of submarine warfare had taken its toll on him. On July 31, 1942, he relinquished command of U-123 and was assigned to training duty, first with the 27th U-boat training flotilla in Gotenhafen, then as chief of U-boat training at the torpedo school at Marineschule Mürwik. Later in the war, he worked in the Torpedo Weapons Development Department, overseeing testing and development of new acoustic and wire-guided torpedoes. In the final months of the war, he served as a battalion commander in Marine Infantry Regiment 6, fighting against British forces in the area around Bremen. Most of the officers in that unit were killed in action. Hartigan survived only because he was hospitalized with a severe case of diphtheria in the last days before the German surrender. After Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, British troops arrested Hartigan, and he spent 18 months as a prisoner of war before being released in late 1946. He returned to Bremen and started an oil trading business that proved successful, and Hartigan became quite wealthy. He served on Bremen City Council for 32 years, from 1952 to 1984, representing the Christian Democratic Union Party. He remained active in veterans affairs and maintained contact with other former U-boat commanders throughout his life. In interviews conducted later in life, Hartigan was quite careful about how he discussed the war years. He insisted he was not a Nazi and that he'd done his duty for his country, not for Hitler. He stated that by 1942, he and his crew had realized Hitler was a madman driving Germany toward catastrophe. He expressed skepticism about some aspects of Nazi atrocities, though historians note he was secluded at training bases and never served on the Eastern Front where the worst crimes were being committed. When asked about the merchant sailors he had killed during the war, Hartigan maintained that he had tried to help survivors whenever possible. He claimed he'd provided food and navigation directions to lifeboats, ordered neutral ships to pick up survivors, and believed in fighting honorably, even in submarine warfare. Historical records partially support these claims. Survivors from several ships Hartigan sank reported that the U-boat surfaced and the commander directed them toward the nearest land or shipping lanes. In at least one documented case, Hartigan forcibly stopped a neutral ship and ordered it to rescue survivors from a tanker he'd just sunk. But other survivors reported no such assistance whatsoever. The reality was complex and nuanced. Submarine commanders had to balance humanitarian impulses against their own survival needs. Stopping to help survivors exposed the submarine to counterattack, and spending time on the surface in hostile waters was extremely dangerous. Most commanders, including Hartigan, helped when they could do so safely, but when they couldn't, they left survivors to their fate. Hartigan never mentioned USS Attic specifically in his memoirs or interviews. The engagement had lasted only a few hours, and to him, it was just another merchant ship, just another target among many. He didn't realize Attic was a Q ship until German radio broadcast the news on April 9th, and even then, it didn't register as particularly significant to him. He had survived, his U-boat had survived, and he'd sunk the enemy vessel. Mission accomplished. Time to move on to the next target. The fact that 141 American sailors died in that encounter apparently didn't trouble him particularly. They were the enemy, they were trying to kill him, he succeeded, and they failed. That was war in his view. Hartigan lived to be 105 years old, dying on June 9, 2018 in Bremen, Germany. He was the last surviving U-boat ace from Operation Drumbeat. German newspapers published lengthy obituaries calling him a naval hero, praising his courage and skill, and noting his post-war civilian service. Most obituaries briefly mentioned that he'd sunk 22 ships during the war. A few mentioned USS Attic specifically as the only American Q-ship sunk in World War II. But none mentioned the 141 men who died when Attic exploded. For administrative purposes, Rear Admiral Russell Wilson wrote in a memorandum on July 2, 1942, that the ship should be considered lost on March 27, 1942. He added that aside from notifications already made to dependents, no further publicity would be given to the loss of this ship. USS Attic was classified, the mission was secret, and the loss was not announced publicly at all. The families of the crew members received telegrams stating missing in action, lost at sea, with no details provided and no explanation given. Official death notifications were not sent to families until April 5, 1944, more than 2 full years after the sinking occurred. The official U.S. Navy history of Project LQ was written after the war, based on records that had been maintained in secret files by the Chief of Naval Operations during the conflict. The assessment was brutally honest and unflinching. The Q-ship program was a complete failure from start to finish. The concept was fundamentally flawed, the execution was poor, and the results were non-existent. 0 U-boats sunk, 1 Q-ship lost with all hands, and millions of dollars wasted on a program that achieved nothing. The analysis recommended definitively that Q-ship tactics should never be used again by the Navy. Modern submarines were too fast and too well armed for surface ships to compete with them effectively. The only effective anti-submarine weapons available were aircraft, destroyers equipped with sonar and depth charges, and properly organized convoy escorts. Q-ships belonged to World War I and had absolutely no place in modern naval warfare. The fundamental problem with the entire concept was that Q-ships required submarines to surface and close to gun range before they could be effective. That tactic had worked during World War I when submarines had limited battery capacity and spent most of their time operating on the surface. But by World War II, submarines had much better diesel engines, larger battery banks, and could remain submerged for extended periods of time. More importantly, German submarine commanders had thoroughly studied British Q-ship tactics from the previous war and knew exactly what signs to look for. A ship sailing alone in dangerous waters, traveling without escorts, in suspiciously good condition for a supposedly civilian vessel, with a crew that seemed too disciplined and unusual handling characteristics. These were all red flags. German standing orders by 1942 explicitly warned commanders to be extremely cautious of potential Q-ships, instructing them to attack from maximum range with torpedoes whenever in doubt, avoiding surfacing and closing to gun range, and never giving the enemy a chance to spring a surprise. Hartigan had violated those standing orders when he engaged Attic. He'd surfaced, close to 700 yards, and planned to use his deck gun, and he nearly paid for that decision with his life and his boat. The fact that Attic managed to damage U-123 and kill 1 crewman proved the Q-ship concept could work, at least in theory. But one damaged submarine was not worth the loss of 141 trained sailors and an entire ship. The mathematics were simply brutal and undeniable. Project LQ consumed resources that could have been used far more effectively elsewhere. The 5 ships required crews totaling over 500 men, who could have instead manned destroyer escorts or patrol craft. The 5 ships required fuel, ammunition, supplies, maintenance facilities, and port services. All of those resources were desperately needed for other purposes in early 1942. The $500,000 spent on Project LQ could have funded other anti-submarine programs, like improved depth charges, better sonar equipment, additional patrol aircraft, or training for escort crews. Any of those investments would have produced significantly better results than Q ships ever did. Lieutenant Commander Harry Linwood Hicks was never found. His body was not recovered, and none of the crew were recovered either. The explosion that destroyed USS Attic left absolutely nothing behind except wreckage scattered across miles of ocean. The Navy listed Hicks and his entire crew as killed in action on March 27, 1942. They are commemorated on the tablets of the missing at various military cemeteries, with their names carved in stone, but they have no graves. They rest somewhere on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, 300 miles east of Norfolk, Virginia, and the exact location of the wreck remains unknown to this day. In 1990, author Michael Gannon published Operation Drumbeat, a comprehensive history of the German U-boat campaign off the American coast. Gannon spent years meticulously researching German and American records, interviewed Reinhard Hardigan extensively, studied the logs of U-123, and analyzed the tactics used during Operation Drumbeat. In his book, Gannon devoted significant attention to USS Attic and Project LQ, calling it one of the most misguided programs of the entire war, a complete waste of ships and lives, and a desperate response to a crisis that required better, more thoughtful solutions. Gannon estimated that the resources spent on Project LQ could have built 2 destroyer escorts, which would have been far more effective at hunting U-boats than disguised merchant ships. He noted that the 141 men who died on USS Attic were trained sailors who could have served on other vessels where they might have survived the war and contributed meaningfully to the war effort. Gannon concluded that Project LQ was a perfect example of how desperation can lead to poor decisions and terrible outcomes. The program was created because President Roosevelt wanted a quick solution to the U-boat crisis. Admiral King implemented it because he felt pressured to take action immediately. The Navy converted 5 ships because there was tremendous political pressure to do something, anything, to stop the U-boats. But nobody stopped to ask whether Q-ships would actually work in modern naval warfare. Nobody questioned whether the tactics that had barely worked in World War I would be effective against experienced U-boat commanders in 1942. Nobody calculated whether the risks were worth the potential rewards. The program was doomed from the very start, and USS Attic and her crew paid the price for that failure. The wreck of USS Attic has never been found or identified. The ocean is extremely deep where she went down, and the currents are strong. Wreckage from World War II ships is scattered all along the Atlantic coast. Fishing boats sometimes bring up pieces of metal, but identifying the source is almost impossible. USS Attic could be anywhere in a 100-square-mile area. She could be resting in one piece or scattered in fragments across the seafloor. The pulpwood cargo might have disintegrated decades ago. The guns might be buried deep in sand. The hull might be covered in marine growth. Nobody knows for certain, and nobody is actively looking. There are too many wrecks, too much ocean, and too few resources dedicated to finding them. U.S. Attic is just one more casualty of a war that happened over 80 years ago. That's how failure happens in war. Not through incompetence or cowardice, but through desperation and poor judgment. When leaders are under intense pressure to act, they sometimes choose the wrong solutions. When options are limited, they sometimes pick the least bad choice, instead of waiting for better options to emerge. When resources are scarce, they sometimes waste them on programs that cannot possibly succeed. Project LQ was not created by bad people or incompetent people. It was created by desperate people trying to save lives and stop an enemy that was winning decisively. But desperation is not strategy, pressure is not wisdom, and quick action is not always the right action. USS Attic and 141 American sailors died because someone decided that Q-ships were the answer to the U-boat threat. They were not the answer. The real answer was convoys, air patrols, radar, sonar, destroyer escorts, and time to implement these solutions properly. Those solutions took longer to implement, they were less dramatic and didn't make headlines, but they worked effectively. By the end of 1943, the U-boat threat was contained. By mid-1944, German submarines were being hunted and destroyed faster than Germany could build them. The Battle of the Atlantic was won decisively, but USS Attic and her crew never saw that victory. They died in March 1942, just 3 months into America's war, sailing a ship that never should have gone to sea, fighting an enemy with tactics that never should have been used. What worked against the U-boats was not clever deception or traps. What worked was the systematic application of technology, tactics, and resources. Convoy escort became standard practice by mid-1942, with every merchant ship crossing the Atlantic, sailing in organized groups, protected by destroyers, destroyer escorts, and corvettes. The escorts were equipped with sonar, depth charges, and increasingly effective radar systems. They worked in coordinated teams, sharing information constantly and covering each other's blind spots. When a U-boat attacked a convoy, it faced immediate counterattack from multiple ships simultaneously. Air coverage extended farther and farther into the Atlantic as new long-range patrol aircraft entered service. The consolidated B-24 Liberator bomber, modified for maritime patrol duties, could fly nearly 2,000 miles from base. These aircraft were equipped with radar that could detect surfaced submarines from miles away and carried depth charges that allowed them to attack U-boats before the submarines even knew they were there. The so-called Atlantic Gap, the area in mid-ocean beyond the range of land-based aircraft, shrank progressively month by month as new air bases were established in Greenland, Iceland, and the Azores. By late 1943, there was no gap anymore, and every convoy had air cover throughout its entire passage across the Atlantic. Escort carriers, small aircraft carriers built on merchant ship hulls, provided air cover even in the middle of the Atlantic. These carriers were exactly what Project LQ should have been from the beginning. They looked like merchant ships and sailed with convoys, but instead of trying to trick U-boats into surface gun battles, they provided aircraft that could hunt submarines from above. The escort carriers worked brilliantly. They sank U-boats, they protected convoys, and they were worth every dollar invested in them. Technology improved rapidly throughout this period. Sonar became more accurate, depth charges became more powerful, and Hedgehog and Squid anti-submarine mortars could fire patterns of charges ahead of the attacking ship, dramatically increasing the chances of a hit. Radar improved to the point where it could detect periscopes and even submarine snorkels breaking the surface. Direction-finding equipment could locate U-boats by their radio transmissions. Code breaking became increasingly sophisticated. By mid-1943, Allied intelligence was reading German naval communications on a regular basis, allowing convoy routes to be adjusted to avoid known U-boat concentrations, and task forces to be dispatched to hunt U-boats, whose positions had been revealed by decrypted messages. Training improved dramatically as well. New destroyer escort crews spent months in specialized schools, learning anti-submarine tactics in great detail. They practiced attack runs repeatedly, studied U-boat behavior patterns, and learned to work effectively as coordinated teams. By 1944, American and British escort crews were highly skilled professionals who knew their business inside and out. Industrial production overwhelmed the German submarine force completely. American shipyards built Liberty ships faster than U-boats could possibly sink them. In 1942, the United States launched over 5 million tons of merchant shipping. In 1943, over 19 million tons were launched. By 1944, the production rate exceeded anything the U-boats could possibly destroy. Even at the peak of their effectiveness in 1942, U-boats sank less than 8 million tons per year. The numbers were completely unsustainable for Germany. Perhaps most importantly, the Allies never gave up. When tactics failed, they tried new tactics. When technology proved inadequate, they developed better technology. When training was insufficient, they improved the training programs. When resources were lacking, they built more resources. The war in the Atlantic was won through relentless, systematic improvement. Project LQ represented the opposite approach entirely. It was a desperate gamble on an unproven concept that relied on outdated tactics from World War I. It wasted resources that could have been used far more effectively, sent men to sea in ships that were not ready for combat, and when it failed, the program was quietly abandoned without learning the right lessons. The right lesson was not that Q-ships couldn't work. The right lesson was that gimmicks don't win wars. Steady application of proven methods wins wars. Technology, training, resources, and determination win wars. USS Attic proved that lesson at the terrible cost of 141 lives. If you found this story meaningful, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We work hard to bring you forgotten stories from World War II, the stories that textbooks skip over, the missions that official histories ignore, and the ships and sailors who served and died without recognition or acknowledgement. These stories matter because they remind us that war is not just about the victories we celebrate. War is also about the failures we learn from, the mistakes we acknowledge honestly, and the lives lost in pursuit of solutions that did not work. USS Attic represents a painful truth that needs to be remembered. Sometimes courage is not enough. Sometimes determination is not enough. And sometimes even the best intentions lead to tragedy. The 141 men who sailed on USS Attic were brave beyond question. They knew the mission was dangerous, and they went anyway. They deserved better than to die on a ship that was not ready, executing a plan that could not succeed, in a program that was canceled just 3 months after they were killed. Their names are carved on memorial walls, but their story was classified for decades. Most Americans have never heard of USS Attic, and most historians do not mention Project LQ in their accounts. The program was an embarrassment, a failure, something the Navy wanted to forget and move past. But forgetting failures means we risk repeating them. Remembering USS Attic means remembering that wars are won not by desperate gambles, but by careful planning, proper equipment, realistic tactics, and the willingness to admit when something is not working. The United States won the Battle of the Atlantic because the Navy eventually abandoned failed programs. like Project LQ, and focused on solutions that actually worked. That lesson cost 141 lives, and we should not forget them. Thank you for watching, and please leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community includes history enthusiasts from every corner of the world, and we appreciate every single one of you.